os guardiões daquelas 50 meninas. Mandaram novas máquinas, todas delas.
Dois só? São dois só?
Estou a ouvir? Não? Sim?
Use it.
No, it doesn't matter. People in Britain had told me about Robin Fior before I came to Portugal. And then when I arrived in Portugal, I discovered that the library had a small part of the legacy of Robin Fior, so it seemed to make doubly good sense. But I thought that the whole project depended on having the right curator. And it was when I went to see an exhibition in Oporto with Ana Belisa and Alexandra Strela, and talked a bit more with Ana Belisa about her background and career, because she's a graphic designer. I thought Ana Belisa could be the right curator for this project. And she has done a beautiful job, and I hope you've all seen the exhibition. If you haven't, it ends very soon, so make sure that you do. And we've had a couple of talks in the exhibition, and this is the final talk not in the exhibition, and we're very pleased that Richard Hollis is here with us. It's a great honour. And I must say that as someone who's worked in the art world in London for quite a long time, or in Britain for over 30 years, Richard Hollis has been a name that has always figured in the British art world, so it's very nice to have him here to talk about Robin Fior and more, I'm sure. So now I'll hand over to Anna, who's going to chair the session and begin the evening. Thank you, Anna. No, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. So could we dim the lights, please? Okay, thank you. So thank you all for coming. So I think Penelope did a great job introducing me, thank you. Richard was a colleague of Robin, also a great friend, has worked on several projects together, or let's say they did work on the same projects sort of in sequence. Richard's gonna focus on Robin's London years, and it would be I will try to interrupt whenever I think something should be commented, and that's it. I will hand this to Richard now. Thank you for coming, Richard.
It's a great pleasure to be here again in Lisbon, because I think almost every other time I've been here, in fact, to see Robin Fior, who was a great friend, a great colleague, and was certainly, I don't know about the most revolutionary designer I've ever known, but certainly one of the funniest. But his stories were much too complicated to talk about. He's presented very much, though, as a revolutionary designer, but I think it has to be remembered that the period in which most of the works that are shown from the London period, the circumstances in which they were done, because it was during the height of the Cold War, and the nuclear threat was something which was very, very present, and people were actually living under a threatening cloud, or almost of an annihilation which was coming. He believed that political and social causes were advanced by design, and this is what he spent most of his time doing. He was original, but mostly he was original, certainly as a person, but in design, his originality was confined to a few outstanding works, which we'll have a look at. his engagement with was with the other, apart from nuclear disarmament, with other pressing issues of that period. Apart from the nuclear threat, there were human rights, because racism in England was really as extreme. Well, I wouldn't say it was extreme now, but it can be extreme, and was then. And one of the posters which he shows was a call for legalization to abolish the way in which landlords, for example, could advertise properties to let for rent, in which they said that no coloured people could apply. Sometimes it said no coloured, no Irish, and no dogs. I think I want also to show various original aspects of him as a personality, because unlike most designers, he didn't go to art school. He was self-taught. So that in a way he lacked the various prejudices which went with art school training and the very elaborate academic training that my generation went through, in which we had to do everything that artists did. We had, for example, to draw casts of classical sculpture. We had to do anatomy. We had to do composition of paintings, life classes, and so on. So he avoided all that. He went straight to looking at print, but partly he did this through an interest in calligraphy. He was at one of the most expensive, exclusive private schools in England, but rather than that, a system which can stifle creativity, he found that in printing there and in learning to make beautiful letters, this conditioned very much of his later work. And we'll see that in many examples where you can trace this background. But it's also, after school, he then went to Oxford University to study English. Now, he didn't work, and he left after a year, but his interest in words, and after all, graphic design is concerned as much with words as it is with images, and this is what is particularly special to his work, the analysis of language which went together with images to convey a message. What is particularly interesting about his work is also that, of course, it was before computers, so that there's a lot of hands-on craft involved. And before computers, of course, designers used to work mostly on drawing boards, tracing typefaces, and they spent a great deal of their time interacting with the print trade, giving them instructions, going to see them, talking to them. It was a very different activity from much graphic design and typography now, which is done at the keyboard, and the instructions are given just digitally to the printer. More or less just get on with it, rather than in discussion about how best to do a job. I think Robin Fior also was eccentric in that he learnt by teaching, and in fact he learnt first of all by a friendship with a particular printer, which happened to be near where his father's office was in central London, so that he would go along there, and when, for example, he wanted to have something designed and printed, the printer would, together with him, design. And what was with this particular printer, he was somebody who was influenced by Central European design and imported typefaces which nobody else had in London. And so Robin Fior had access to the most up-to-date technology of letterpress printing. He was original, but as I've said, it really depended on a few particular works. The important thing I've found, and maybe we will see this, is that he didn't really repeat himself unless there was a reason for doing it. Each job almost was seen as original. I shall also mention some of the influences on him, which are very easily detectable, but mainly I will just take you through the work, not in particularly a chronological order, but in a way to introduce you, to enlarge a bit on what I think is a wonderful exhibition showing work, some of which I'd actually never seen, and some of it really surprising in every way. So if we have a look at some of his history. Is this the right way?
I think so.
Yes. Now, when I say about his having been, training himself to read and write, this is typical of one of the principal aims of his work. A revolutionary graphic language must seek to expose the meaning, that's the meaning of the message, by presenting a chain of ideas, images and structures in as much of their complexity as is economic and feasible. This sounds very academic language, but in fact it was quite practical. Now, when I say that he went to an elite public school, this is typical of him at the age of about 16, very serious-minded, and much of the time he spent in the printing workshop. And at a very young age, he read a book which was actually designed for the Labour Party, and he immediately worked with a printer to design something which was absolutely of its time in letterpress printing. But you can see how he has actually broken up the text so that the first thing that you see, and he thought that the reader was part of the whole process of communication, that you see the main thing, that it's Stephen Young, who is a famous speaker on foreign affairs, and then the details of where it is, when it is, if it costs anything, are then laid back in the rest. Having got the reader's attention, then they are the underlying details. And this is, you would see in many of his works, there's this sequence of ideas starting with the most significant as the largest, most prominent feature. Now, he was interested early on in using print really to help communicate ideas and somehow organizing it there was a certain way of, this is what you should do. There was a kind of didacticism, but which it was, but very laid back, so that he was really helping people in a constructive way. And this is for the cab drivers organization in London, in their weekly newspaper. He also, with his leftist politics, designed in a quite straightforward way Fortnightly, which preceded this magazine, for which he did many covers, of which this is not typical. Anna, you know about this? That it, in fact, well, it says it's issue 1. It never actually appeared, did it?
No, it exists.
It did appear.
It did.
But
I think it's quite rare, and also I found a lot of people to dismiss this cover because in relation to the other ones, because it's far too simple in relation to the other ones. But I believe everything here is, you have the basic of the puzzle pieces that he's gonna play with. Yes. In the next cover, so I think this is very
untypical of all the series that he did up to issue 20 of this magazine. What is interesting at this period is that printing was, generally speaking, black and a colour if it wasn't black alone. And what Robin Fior did was to use almost invariably two colours, neither of which was black. Of course, this was slightly more expensive because the printer had to wash up the machine, because machines usually were carrying black if they were, because usually they were printed in sequence, one colour and then another, not together, unless it happened to be a two-colour press. So this shows you the blue printing on the yellow. Now, for these. They were, well, more or less quarterly or half-yearly. Actually, the magazine started chaotically because this was actually issue number 3, so it had to have stickers put on it to show it was number 3. But it gradually settled down, and there was usually this documentary photograph overlaid by the main title. The previous one, I beg your pardon. Oh,
sorry. Oops, sorry. Fast forward.
We didn't want to go backwards, but it's not a bad idea.
Wow.
The previous one, which showed was...
Here.
Is that previous?
Yes.
Was... Well, South Africa and apartheid was one of the issues with which everyone was concerned at the time. And Robin Fior belonged to something which was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, of which there was a core committee of 100 who had actually vowed that they would go to prison rather than accept the idea of having nuclear weapons. In fact, some of them did, including I think there's another way of doing this.
Okay. So we're here.
The committee of 100 was literally a committee to doing away with nuclear weapons. It wasn't, of course, successful. But generally speaking, Robin used documentary photographs. Later on, he directed photographs to make montages and carry out ideas. This was after the death of Gandhi for an issue on India. This was for an issue talking about Hungary after the uprising, when was it, 56. Now, he wasn't only designing covers, he was also designing the interiors of these magazines and organising them with a very strict typography, sometimes using grotesque typefaces, there was one called Series 125, which was just monotype grotesque, which had a bold with it. And sometimes he was just using a bold grotesque often with Times Roman.
But
now,
Richard, sorry to interrupt you. Just before you were showing the covers and the fact that they're not using any black, perhaps you could talk about that first poster you did with Robin.
About the which?
the first poster you did with Robin, the one that doesn't exist anymore, with the Hiroshima
yes,
photo.
I was also a silkscreen printer in a rather amateurish way. And one poster we did, which was obviously an anti-nuclear poster, we found a documentary photograph of Hiroshima after the explosion and devastation, and I forgot that, and which was printed in a sort of olive green color, and superimposed on it, I think, was the message about what it implied, what the future held, but it was the combination of the word with the documentary image which seemed to be most energetic in effect. Apart from the documentary images, this is photographs designed to convey the idea of actually coming out of apathy, which unfortunately I think was done the wrong way around, because the apathetic hand held out as though it was a beggar, instead of being obliterated by if that had been printed in red or orange, then the fist, which is meant to be showing the action, would have had a bit more effect. There's the opening title page, to combining left and right, trying to make a sort of flow through a book. Now, when we talk about this image contains so many things which are associated with Robin Fior. That is his attitude to words. How much influence he had on this left-wing member of parliament, Tsiliakos, how much influence he had on the actual title of this book, which was about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was basically a mutual defense weapon. But it was, if you like, anatomized in this book, and so that the word NATO is taken out of the word anatomy. But whether this was Robin Fior's concept or the writer's...
It was because the writer didn't like it. In fact, the writer reacted against it, thought it was a bit of a violence, that the designer was taking a liberty with the content. But I think
it's normal, of course, for the client to sit with the author and agree about how something is to be done. It's a sad state of affairs when there isn't that.
But that was the
symbiosis.
Case. Sometimes there is that happened a lot. It seems with Robin, that somehow he conducted his proposal. Sometimes, especially in this period, it seems to be.
Well, because serious political issues and disagreements, and that's why I think the International Socialists, to which Robin Fior belonged, I wouldn't say, but it became vociferous, as a sort of word that he would use. That's to say, it began not exactly to disintegrate, but there were various segments and individuals who left. Amongst many designers, somehow there were very few designers in London, actually, so that the people who were available to design covers for Penguin books, there was a standard layout for them, and the area where there is this gradated image is where you had an opportunity to do something, and some people, of course, had naturalistic drawings or illustrations. It's very typical that Robin, whether he read the book carefully, but presented ethics as something which had a sliding scale of morality, so that he actually has shown this by this this pattern, which could actually be, it could be ordered from a photo engraver, but was also available in a rub-down tint form, called letter set. And this is what he used the first time. The first time he did this cover, he drew it by hand. It's a tremendously difficult thing to do, and I'm sorry to say that it was reprinted. He could take an extremely intelligent way of finding an image by using the Indian flag and using the central circle in it, and using that as part of a descending graph, implying that foreign investments in India, according to Michael Kidron, who was a member of the International Socialist, an economist, basically, also to do with the campaign for nuclear disarmament, for which this is one of Robin Fior's most original posters. It depends entirely upon the organization of the words, put in their most important order as he saw them. Now, the difficulty of doing this was extraordinary, because all he had to use was wood letters, wood type for the call to action and the second line, and the 18th December 1961, and in where it says in demand, and the rest of it was metal type, and the rule going across would have been a wooden rule, and the word rally would also have been in wood type. Now, type, of course, you can't change the spacing in it. You can make it greater, but you can't make it closer together. But he had them set it with just as tight as it was possible to be. But you couldn't make a lot of difference between lines, because if you had descenders, you would have to have a line below further away. And sometimes, of course, lines had room for descenders on the bottom of the letters underneath 18th February 1961, for example. There would actually be wood, the base of the type. So other things couldn't be compressed. What he did, because I knew this printer well and also used him for similar work, he was completely straightforward, cheap printer who printed local things. Amazingly, in the centre of London, there were still small printers, because rents when those at that time weren't particularly expensive. And what he's done here too is, if you notice the use of the punctuation, using full points, full stops after to demand, that becomes a colon leading to what is demanded. Then using full stops to make a sort of a space before all the other elements are involved, and the way in which it is divided between black and colour. And it's very unusual for people to print blue, and he chose to print things often on wrapping paper, but we could come to this later, because it's a common feature of some of his work to avoid using anything other than white paper to give a sort of, it makes it tactically more interesting, but it gives a sort of unity which adds actually an aesthetic quality to something which is, in a way, nothing to do with aesthetics. It's not as though it's an art poster, but it's become almost an art poster. This anti-nuclear demo, and many of his posters were for demonstrations, calling people to attend, saying who the speakers were. And the way in which he's put the no in inverted commas shows this, in a way, you're meant almost to read this and say no. And that's the function of the demonstrators, was in fact to say no to having American weapons and missiles in England.
For instance, that poster, I think it was censored when it was put up on London Tube. Yeah.
Well, there are certain rules for posters certain posters. If it asked for sedition, then the people who were promoting it, the poster could be banned and people would be summoned and arrested.
But the thing is that they put it up. The only thing that they censored was the word no. So actually, it looked like it was for Polaris, but they left the single quotes, so there was something missing there. So that's
which would have attracted people even more.
Yes, exactly.
This was for a demonstration. Yes, these missiles were also based in Scotland, so they're in somewhere called the Holy Loch, and there was a song made which people sang at these meetings. Now, just to talk about I'm sorry. Yes, just to talk momentarily about the influences on Robin, it was very typical at that time for while he was teaching at the London School of Printing, he spent a lot of time with other colleagues who were. There was a tremendous interest in Swiss design, of which this is a typical example, although this has the way of using an N as a Z, which is a thing which would have delighted Robin Fior. But it became a cliche in England, so that even in 2003, this sort of Swiss-style accidents, grotesque or Helvetica was just used as a normal, everyday thing. It became, and people used to complain about British railways, that it looked like Swiss rail. Now when we talk about this, whether these were successful in making people attend demonstrations, in fact, I just mentioned this one because it so happened that this one on the 17th of September I attended. And this is the summons that I had from the police telling me to be bound over for the sum of to appear in court the next day, where I was bound over not to break the peace again for £2. And it was interesting in understanding police. I wore a tie and suit to go on demonstrations because I thought it should look as though it wasn't simply the people who weren't in professions and so on, and I wore a suit, of course, very rarely, but more for demonstrations than for actually work. Now, what is I found very strange is that, and it does happen, that having protested against the American nuclear submarines and the missiles, that Robin Fior actually worked for the American embassy, the Americans, the CIA were making a tremendous drive to encourage interest in American culture, to show that it wasn't just what people might think from Polaris missiles, so that Robin Fior actually worked for the American embassy, which I find a very extraordinary conflict of interest. But whether he was, and showing the Statue of Liberty as well seems to me extraordinary. But he did do a whole series of these with graphic images, or particularly American things at the top. Again, it's printed in coloured type on a coloured paper. So he didn't lose his aesthetic interests. Now, the peace movement existed in England for, well, most strongly after the First World War, and Peace News, which Robin Fior designed, was the chief organ which spread information about events, and it was really extremely international. And this was the sort of design which Robin Fior gave to the inside pages. And if one looks at any sort of influence that Robin Fior had in England, it was certainly this, because he had a student when he was teaching at the London School of Printing, who later became a member of the large design group called Pentagram, who redesigned The Guardian in the 70s, and very much under the influence of Peace News, and really under the influence really of Robin's attitudes. And Robin did the normal run of work for private clients, people who came to him. And what is significant about these, having that his influences were as much American as they were continental. And so also the importance of these is not just the influence for American new advertising, as it was called, as his use of a sort of witty use of language, because where it says books for keeping, that's for bookkeeping was the term used for keeping financial records. But they also kept, because this firm, Becker, made products for the paper-making industry. So it was to say that these products helped make things durable and resistant. And on the right-hand side, in the bag, is a colloquial English phrase, we've got it in the bag. In other words, we've done the deal. But what he's saying with that double entendre is actually the idea that in the bag is Becker products which are making this a better bag. And the influence on Robin Fior was American advertising of this type, where you had a single headline and underneath it the most elegantly written, persuasive copy, which is what he emulated. And these are advertisements done by a well-known designer called Brown John, who came and lived in London with with several other designers who had a fairly great influence on Robin Fior. You will see that the star is something which is one of the most important signs that you have in any kind of graphic design. You see it reappear in the if you could call it a logotype, the symbol that was done for the Movimento Esquerda Socialista, which he designed if you like, the badge or symbol for later. He was extremely academic in the sense of researching typefaces, and he found this typeface block, which he made into this logotype for Fisher Fine Art, which was it was set up by Austrians in London, and it was a gallery for which I also worked, and he was making it look like something which came out of Vienna in the 1890s, or around the turn of the century. And this you see also on Esquerda Socialista. The advantage of this typeface design is that it somehow looks informal. It doesn't look as though anyone's given it tremendous attention to its design. It was available in different weights, and sometimes condensed and sometimes an ordinary weight. And Robin Fior also did this kind of work. He had an assistant, one who had been a student at the Central School, who did the actual, what would be called the artwork, the finished drawing for this kind of stationery. Robin Fior also did several works for architects. This was for a swimming pool where he made the height of the dimensions of, the depth of the pool, the nearest to where the numerals were, that the letters were actually 2'6" high. And where the pool was much deeper, the letters were 4'6" high. And this was the sort of wit which he was able really to get away with, but partly because he shared a space in the office of modern architects. And he did this lettering on for an art gallery, which you can see is integrated very carefully into the facade of these vertical laths at the top, and the way in which the lettering is geometrical on the figure on the right-hand side of the number 16. Now, this geometry was partly influenced by a much older friend of Robin Fior's called Edward Wright. In the late 1950s, Edward Wright ran an evening class at the Central School of Art in which all the metal type was locked up because the controller of the print room thought that these evening students would just make a mess of it and get it all marked up. So, but the wood type was released, and Edward Wright ran this class for really quite mature students who just put the type down almost at random, but somehow fixed it in the chaser, inked it up, usually in red and black, and so that Robin Fior had some experience of actually working on a press, although he had some of it when he was at school. He had it quite directly at the Central School. Now, here is his connection with the Gulbenkian, who Gulbenkian financed this catalogue of an exhibition at the Tate Gallery of work done between 1954 and 1964. In other words, it's the paintings and sculpture of a decade. Now you see this aesthetic use of papers other than white paper, a craft wrapping paper for the end papers of the book. You see this very austere half-title to the book. I can't go back to show you what the title was, otherwise we'll go right to the end. Okay. So the half-title, then, the actual position of 54 and 64 on the half-title is actually repeated in exactly the same place on the title page. And there's no particular grid to this book. It emerges later when there are smaller pictures, but on the whole, the images are thrown to the bottom of the page, and often the type as well. What is astonishing about this book is that it's printed letterpress on not very smooth paper, and the quality of the reproductions is astonishing. Here you can see a tendency towards a grid just because you have two paintings which are reproduced the same height. But Robin Fior also had a love for numerals, so that the most important things on the page are the number of the catalogue number rather than the name of the artist. And the index was arranged in a typically Swiss way, with the first name of the artist ranged to the right and the surname of the artist ranged to the left with a central axis. And the final page shows the actual block of all the acknowledgements to the picture sources and to the designer, and the end papers, of course, are this craft wrapping paper. And this tendency comes from the influence of the Dutch typographer, who was also the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Willem Sandberg, who used a great deal of this rough textured paper. These are the legal proposals for banning the use of racist advertising, and it's impossible to show what this label above says, but it's actually it's got this message of saying no colours. One of the most important of the left-wing, or certainly labour-oriented journals, was the New Statesman Weekly, and this was Robin Fior's proposal for it, using as the main heading, using a quite English 19th century typeface. And I can't remember what the actual well, that's a Clarendon, but the text, I think, was probably set also in a 19th century style face. Now, when I worked as art editor of this weekly magazine for, well, you could call it sociological, but it was also a general subject, but not political magazine. But I quickly got Robin to design various covers, which he did this is where he began to use both documentary photographs and commissioned photographs. Social policy on the left-hand side is seen to be still in filing baskets. In other words, the implication being that nothing happened. Renationalization was molten steel is being poured over the word re, implying that nationalization was the way to go. And simply he got a child's book to illustrate an education.
It's Liza's drawing. It's his daughter's drawing.
But inevitably.
It's easier.
And it's interesting that Robin Fior was one of the people to stress his Jewishness for the whole period, I think, during which he was working for international socialism. He changed his first name to Rubin, as did one or two other Jewish people, certainly the socialist people, not necessarily to identify with Israel. But this was implying that Israel was desperately in need of funds. He put this collecting tin and wrapped an Israeli coloured flag around it and showed a map. And there's a great deal of information put here, and he would have had this photographed and then separated the blue from the black. Again, this is instances where so often things were in two colours, because four-colour printing was actually very little used until colour magazines came in, weekly colour magazines, supplements to Sunday magazines came in the 1960s.
Was the two-color composition something you set as a rule? Because you were doing the art direction for that magazine as well, right?
Yes, the inside of the magazine was always black only. It was printed, on newspaper presses in the country. A local newspaper in Buckinghamshire, which is just one of the counties outside London.
But the two-color composition on the cover was actually something you set as a rule.
Everyone had two colours on the cover to do yes. This was an illustration. You see, you never knew quite. Often you had to cut text to fit the illustration. You had an idea of the sort of space there would be. You would give the illustrator the article to read so that they would be able to illustrate it, to make it clearer what it was about. This was about training groups, which were called T groups for managers. So Robin Fior has turned a Superman-like figure flaming with energy and has brought him forward in front of these very staid managers. And he had the editor hated what he did, incidentally. I thoroughly approved of it, of course. This was an article about privacy. Now, how do you actually illustrate that? And what he did was he had somebody photographed in a lounge chair, deck chair, reading the newspaper. And he then made a montage by showing a photograph of the front of a camera, and within the camera showing exactly what it was that the man was reading, so that it was really about intrusive journalism. And the man is reading a paper which says that his wife-swapping parties are over, which is typical of the popular press and also their attitude to privacy. It was actually a very brilliant conception. In an article about the economist J.K. Galbraith, he simply did an illustration, but what is careful about it is that he had actually separated the ideas which Galbraith was involved in, which was the automobile industry, the military, and academia. So he's found ways of depicting these and then separating them with a slash from Galbraith. And the future, when he was given an article on the future of sociology, he just produced this image of someone at the computer, as though inevitably the producer would produce Marxist ideas. And there's Marx emerging from the computer on this scroll. Now, 1968, the year of the student revolts, particularly in Paris, but as you see in London, Rome, and Berlin, Robin Fior didn't mind that in typographic terms there was a certain crudeness, and he simply was able to choose from the printer bold types for we, so we shall fight, we will win. Now, most English people wouldn't differentiate between shall and will, because shall is simply in the future, but will implies definitely this will happen, and it implies will, the will of the people. The inside of this newspaper or magazine was laid out in a fairly conventional way, but it's typical that he would put the times across the top of the column on the right-hand page of the night of May the 10th, what happened in Paris, so that it becomes a sort of historical account, also in the way that it is laid out. And similarly here, it's just, there's a poem in the middle, there on the left-hand page, and an article about Che Guevara with images of Che Guevara speaking on the right-hand page. The actual content is very typical of the period at the time. And this is one of the final pages where, because it's the back page, he's got red on the front and the back, but not on the inside pages, so it's more economical. And he also commissioned illustrations and cartoons. Now, this is to do with the apartheid in South Africa, because the English cricket team was going to play in South Africa, and he's saying, this should be abandoned. So just as he used no to Polaris, he's using no to this. But what is most interesting about this, one of the aspects of Robin Fior's work is that sometimes he thought that what he would perhaps describe as a kind of demotic approach, a kind of popular kind of imagery that you might find in comics, was more likely to reach the kind of audience, the kind of people who would actually protest, because you can't say that the balmy army of cricket followers, English cricket followers, would actually appreciate the high aesthetics of some of Robin Fior's posters. It's a different audience to the those who were campaigned for nuclear disarmament. Now, he also took a different kind of direct action in a way, with making a billboard so that people who were going on holiday, maybe in South Africa, going to Heathrow Airport, driving there on the left would see this billboard. So have a good time, but remember, amnesty for Spain's political prisoners. So that there are dual messages going on. One is, it was a typical idea. It's like having the old and the new, which is used to create a dramatic graphic effect. Now, also the war in Vietnam was a particular issue, and for the smart left-wing people, the bags such as this were designed so that they could parade their allegiance. So I say that with some cynicism, because however this aesthetic the bag is, and it did, however, by selling it, raise money for the anti-war movement. Now, when I say that Robin Fior was influenced by the Swiss, there was a different kind of Swiss, which was also the idea which you had seen on the International Socialist covers, placing one image in front of another, not actually fusing them as he has on another occasion, but almost contrasting. Here's the intellectual and the workers and the people demonstrating and the crowd watching the demonstration. And this is the main influence here, and this isn't a frankly good example of the Swiss designer Lohse, who had taken, this is about work and money. So the work is illustrated by the workers, the Asian workers, and the money is shown by a South African bond certificate. So he carries ideas, the two ideas which connect to the title. These are the pages inside where he's linked the left to right, implying the reading forward. Now at the bottom you see the Pluto Press symbol, which Robin Fior designed, so that the two P's make a kind of arrow as the forward. And this was also adapted in various ways by, it was even turned into a shovel.
True.
And this is, you can see the use of this block typeface, which Robin constantly brought out as, well, you could say as a new weapon, because although it was old, it seemed new. This is another case in which he is printing in this case in 3 colors, so that there's type. Because it's a reprint, he's showing the text going downwards is from the original edition of this book, and the person speaking is actually the author of the book, who is also a well-known orator, and the title and the G.T. Murphy's name gets somewhat lost, but it's still a compelling cover. Now, Robin Fior was part of a design group, because, as I say, there were very few graphic designers in London. I mean, probably 60 or possibly not more than, but there was a lot of them knew each other and exchanged clients. And this is from the catalogue or the description in a magazine of an exhibition in which Robin Fior featured, and you can see him on the left-hand side, in the middle, in glasses, smiling, and he's underneath Edward Wright, who was to some extent, his mentor, and to the left bottom, 3/4 of the way, there's a number by it, which I think might be 3, with the Germano Facchetti, who was the art editor of Penguin, who gave him the ethics cover to do. And there are all these people who really knew one another, and you could say they were I don't like to use the word elite, but they were the people perhaps the most respected. Now, there was a movement also to encourage designers to do work in more useful directions than working as a consumer society. In other words, it was partly against people working in advertising. Personally, I was happy that I wasn't at this time in London, because it's an extremely pious statement signed by people who, only 2 of whom I knew to have devoted themselves to what you would call using graphic design in a socially effective way, who there was an element of revolution about them. One of them I went to teach in Africa, another worked almost exclusively in educational books, and so on. So that but there was, on the other hand, a kind of coherent group of people who would get together to use design for socially responsible ends. Now, this is the symbol of something which was called the graphic ring. It's a rather silly story, but people get interested in it, because when there was a census in England, it said you had to fill in a form which said what profession you to belong to. And I didn't know what to do, so I rang up Robin Fior and said, what profession are you putting? And we both agreed to say we were visual engineers. So this appeared as our document. And then it had said, what professional organisation do you belong to? Neither of us belonged to a professional organisation. So we said, well, we'd better make one. So we made one called the Graphic Ring, for which this is the symbol. And we were the only 2 members, although people did struggle to join. And one became an agr, who was, and sometimes, I don't know that I ever put this as an abbreviation after my name, but it was used in the Central School prospectus where I was teaching at the time. But it wasn't a serious thing, but it was to dissociate ourselves from the idea of graphic design, because it was becoming, graphic designers were just identified as being people who wore khaki ties and wore desert boots. And by about 1960, it was more to do with style and not to do with anything effective. Robin was very opposed to the kind of revolution that was suggested by the underground press, which he took to pieces in what I call a famous article for the Designer magazine, which was, and this contained this statement, which says that, that these, Oz was one of the magazines that's saying that it's simply not revolutionary. This was at a time when Mick Jagger was talking about revolution, and there was even a nightclub in London called Revolution. It was extraordinary. And what he's saying is that the underground press was actually only about quite superficial things. It appears as a spray-on soft-edge mirror surface defined by electric rock music, drugs, communes, plug-ins, sex, sexism, geodesics, that's Buckminster Fuller, mysticism, orgasms, macrobiotics, ecology, doing one's own thing, improvisation, astrology, and revolution. But what was revolutionary about it? I mean, it made no distinction between Lenin and John Lennon. That's the sort of Robin Fior speaking. And this was the article in which it appeared where he actually typewrote most of it and put it together as a collage, which was totally alien to the actual design of this magazine called The Designer, which was the, I suppose you call it, not the news, it was printed on glossy art paper and very designed in a kind of elegant way, but this was really totally opposed to it, so it was rather surprising that they went ahead and published it. The apartheid in Africa was an issue which was, of course, important, but if one could talk about any influence that Robin Fior had, it was on this kind of design, which is done by somebody who was a great friend of Robin Fior's, David King, about whom a book will come out later this year. And it was this kind of revolutionary, because it was in fact it was to some extent a graphic revolution. You can see the amount of work involved and the influence of Robin in the kind of literary content of a poster, which is in a way crazy, because you would have to have this poster and read it. You're not going to stand up in the street and read something like this, but by having a large apartheid being very big, people would know exactly what it was about and then maybe get involved in it. And then this kind of what you would call revolutionary design, which was derived from Russian constructivism, which was something, well, David King was a great, well, I wouldn't say he was a protégé of Robin Fior's, but they were considerable friends, but Robin Fior didn't actually approve of this backwards-looking romantic notion of what was happening to go on in the Soviet Union, which was actually appalling. Now, what Robin is surprising is that his office was around the corner from Carnaby Street, which was the most fashionable street for clothes for young people at exactly that time. And it was this kind of atmosphere of stylishness which appeared in Oz and the underground magazines, which was to which he was most opposed. And that was partly one of the impulses for his coming to Portugal. He was teaching then in a school outside London where there were some Portuguese students, and they suggested that he might come and teach in Lisbon, and eventually he decided that was the thing, and that's what he did, and that was where I last saw him and why I visited Lisbon not infrequently. Thank you.
Do you want to talk a bit or maybe open for questions?
If anyone wants to ask anything about it.
If anyone wants to ask questions, Toby.
Or complain.
Yes. Well, maybe I have a question.
Or shake fists.
In orange. So how did you actually meet Robin? That's probably when...
I met Robin Fior when I was teaching at the London School of Printing and Graphic Arts, where, because of his slightly Tartar appearance, because his antecedents who came from Eastern Europe, Far Eastern Europe. He was referred to sometimes as the Japanese teacher because they couldn't place him properly. But when he came to the London School of Printing, he came because the printer with whom he worked, Desmond Jeffrey, who was in fact a committed anarchist, but not of a violent sort at all. And he was so committed that, in fact, he said that he would arrange for somebody who was a refugee from the Spanish Civil War and was in a camp in the south of France, said, well, I will do a proxy marriage, and then they would be able to come over here with a visa or whatever was required. And he, in fact, married this woman, and that they worked together as printers. So he was not a champagne anarchist by any means. And Robin actually learnt the business of design from his fellow teachers, who were an extraordinary bunch of people. Some of them who'd been, well, I shared a class, for example, with somebody who'd been a Bauhaus student. There was the brother of the photographer, Bill Brandt. There were other people who had somehow, the head of the design department had just somehow picked up around, and not with advertising, but so that people said, oh, why don't we have so-and-so come and teach? And that was how it happened. But they were all skilled people. Some of them had been in advertising and left advertising. And they said to students things like, look, if you have a picture of a monkey, don't put the word monkey underneath it. There's no tension. So they were very direct. There was a lot of very direct professional teaching from people who were experienced as designers. And as I say, there weren't very many. So this staff formed a sort of coterie, and they arranged exhibitions within the corridors. And in those days, work that had appeared in magazines, there was a magazine called Graphis, the things which had been reproduced there were then circulated, and they could be put up on the walls of the London School of Printing, the design department, so that students had first-hand experience of handling things which were made in different countries, but in Germany, America, Switzerland, they were all there. It was an astonishing place. A few of the students had come from the printing trade. They were people who wanted to go back into the printing trade, but had realized that their father, who was in the printing trade, would have said, you could be a designer. Why don't you go to the design department of the London School of Printing? Don't go to just do day release on something. Mm-hmm. And the London School of Printing and Graphic, it was the largest monotechnic in Europe, and it's now a completely different sort of place because the crafts aren't really taught in the same way at all, partly because, of course, computerization, digitization, and so on, but generally the attitude to the people who are actually making things has changed so much. I'm sorry, this just gives you an idea of the sort of environment in which Robin Fior taught, because, for example, one of his friends was somebody who had been a compositor in the print trade, and he was certainly also, like many people in the print compositors, were extremely well read. He were also left-wing in politics. So it was a mixed place, and of course with quite a lot of foreign teachers. I only think of that now because there were many of the most celebrated designers in England were in fact people who'd been immigrants after immediately before the Second World War, fleeing the terrible things that were going on in continental Europe.
Anyone has a question? Yeah?
I noticed that in a Polaris Berlin, I think, that was blue, there was a tiny part which said by Robin Fior, so he kind of signed the poster. Is that it? I'm curious because he had a sense of authorship in his work, and yet it was the only time I saw his actual name printed as...
He has a few of,
Okay.
of this period. But
Yes. Some of us, I can't speak for Robin, thought it was wrong to have the designer's name on anything, and certainly for a period I would never have my name on anything. If you did book covers, sometimes the publisher insisted on it, but for posters, I think for a long time I would never put my name on it, but I think Robin Fior tended to. I can't be certain about that. I'd have to go around the exhibition and see the real thing, but he would almost always acknowledge the printer,
yes.
and then say printed by Goodwin Press TU to show TU to show that they were trade unionized, because gradually the unions were being diminished in importance, so that he would only use a printer which had union representatives on it, so that everybody was decently looked after, decently paid.
But actually this, I think the detail of the signature is quite interesting, because there is a period when he signs things, and he also signs Ruben instead of Robin, which is, I think, trying to reclaim also his Jewish...
Yes, it was for a short period. You can trace the history of his calling himself Reuben, where there were other Jewish members of the International Socialists. I think several of them together decided to emphasize their Jewish nationality.
So that's from that period.
Origins.
Well, I have another question. Can I ask you another question?
You have a question?
Yes.
What is it?
Well, I would like you to talk a bit about how Robin's language, in graphic design, is very connected to the fact that he learned from the teaching and from the other teachers, and that kind of gives him a freedom in terms of the language, right? That is not very connected to a formal training or a school, or would you like to comment on that?
One of the problems is that in Britain, people in terms of English language are rather badly educated, and so Robin would spend a lot of time actually explaining what the wording of a message actually entailed, and what he did actually was almost to parse a message, to divide it into bits, and try to make them understand a little bit about language which he understood very well. Of course, he spoke extremely slowly with considerable gaps, because he was actually making sure he was saying something which he really meant in the right order. I think it's a very difficult thing, because, and when I was teaching, partly under the influence of the person who was one of my colleagues who taught actually interior design, said that the students, we will spend 1 day a week on English, learning how to write, because a lot of the time of a designer, and he wasn't thinking of graphic designers particularly, is spent actually writing reports or persuading people of something, and it helping them to think about what a particular problem is, and to assemble a questionnaire to find out exactly what the client was thinking. When I say client, it could be anybody. It could be a curator of an exhibition in a museum. It could be an artist. And sometimes one made, under his influence, I certainly made almost insane questionnaires asking people who were shopkeepers, even supposing one was doing a facade for their shop, asking them a huge number of questions about the people who came to the shop, and their backgrounds, their earnings, and all kinds of things, which in a way might have helped establish a relationship with the client because you were taking them seriously. And often they were asking you to do things which were not really relevant to what their actual aim was. So, the main question is, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to get out of this? What is the point of it? Why are you asking me? Are you sure you want a poster? Wouldn't it be better to use the local press? Those sorts of questions which you would hope would arise, so that it was a kind of analytical process in which language was involved too. Does that any help at all?
It was good. Well, actually, there's someone in the audience who worked with Robin as a teacher, because you also said that he learned from teachers, from fellow teachers, and he learned while teaching with students and the teachers. And then he actually became a teacher here in Portugal. And Manuel Costa Cabral, who's the founder of Arco, was quite close to Robin as well. And he had quite a specific style in teaching. Perhaps you would like to comment on that?
Well, I don't know where to start, but Robin was had a lot of problems in getting his teaching through, and the connection with the students. He was very demanding with the students, and he had not a lot of patience with the students. So we had several, but there was a very percentage of students, very small, that really, fall in love with him in terms of a teacher, and decided that Robin was really a guidance for his work, but not the majority of students. The majority of students were not able to understand that it was confusing. It was difficult to understand.
But maybe, Richard, do you think that kind of relates to the way, let's say, the printing school in London was structured in this more free form?
Yes, it was extremely informal. I can't remember it terribly well in that the London School of Printing and Graphics, it was just the design department, and generally speaking, you just walked around. The students sat at desks not unlike this, and you would just, I don't know whether it was Robin's approach, but was just to say, what are you trying to do? Or and that's all. And just try to get them talking, because there was a famous American designer who was blind and who was taught, I think, at Harvard, at the design school, who said he would just say, what is on your drawing board? And his argument was that if you can't explain what is on your drawing board, what it is doing, then you don't know what you're doing. And I think it's that kind of personal thing. This is not really to do with Robin's approach, which I don't know, but I think it's always true that unfortunately students get attracted to a particular teacher, and then the rest of the students don't follow that line, and it's a very sad thing. It's something plainly which I would find rather difficult, because I think things have changed completely, because then classes were relatively small, but usually not more than, I think, if you had more than 20 students, you had 2 staff there all the time, and that was true for a long period when I was teaching. So students and staff got to know each other really extremely well. Or, as Robin Fior says, when he was teaching at the London School of Printing, there were 2 staff there. One of them is more or less redundant, and so that he spent a lot of time in the library. And this is how he came across a lot of this American work, and also, of course, European continental work, which influenced him so much. And he was a devotee of magazines from different countries. He spent a fortune every week on all the magazines, and he looked as much at the advertisements, of course, as he read the articles. But I'm sorry, this doesn't terribly impinge on his teaching.
No, but
except that he was absent.
The classes were not very big. The classes were small number of students. I think the main problem was that Robin wanted people to spend time in thinking, in looking at, and students were more eager to go faster, and they want to, like prompt answers and easy to have the answers immediately, quickly. And Robin was had a pace that was completely different. He wanted people to think about it, to talk about it, and so. And also was the problem of language. I mean, because Robin was teaching in Portuguese, and the Portuguese of Robin was a very peculiar Portuguese. Was very, very special. And students make a little fun of him in terms of the way he speaks Portuguese. And also he invented words. He has a lot of also a Latin, he knew about Latin and Greek origins of the words. So he starts inventing words that people didn't quite understand. But a lot of students, and this is true, look, and I still met them nowadays, that were looking upon Robin as some as someone that really was very important in their lives in terms of what they helped them to discover and to go through. So in the end, he was not a good teacher for the school because a lot of students quit, but he was a very good teacher for the ones that remain, and this was very important.
Remain. Well, any more questions? It would be great, like a last question, perhaps.
I think they're exhausted.
Are they exhausted? Well, Joël.
I saw the name of Stuart Hall that pop up in the exhibition, also in the slides. And I was wondering if, since it seems to have been like a person you've been working with like since the beginning, if like the cultural studies was part of your discussion or like the way you consider graphic design, talking about Stuart Hall.
Yes, sorry, I'm
No?
too deaf.
Sorry.
So what was the question, Joel? Sorry, I also, because I
don't speak Portuguese. Yeah, but that's going to be... No, but...
the question was more to do with
like
Richard's connection to Stuart Hall?
Both, actually, because... Yeah.
Oh, well, yes.
What?
Well, what was your connection, both yours and Robin's, to Stuart Hall? Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall.
Stuart Hall.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
sorry.
yes.
Yes. Sorry.
No, it's very strange that you should mention that, because I was actually reading today a task which Robin set in Adaku, but it's introduced, the task is introduced by a long statement, I haven't got it, which includes the name of Stuart Hall, which is about inverting the notion that of transmission of an idea. I can't remember it clearly myself, but I thought that the mention of this, well, you couldn't say it was esoteric, but this intellectual idea at the beginning of this very simple exercise would puzzle students unless they were going to ask could you explain this rather further? Because the actual task was saying, look, and these were evidently first-year students, the easiest way to learn typography is to start with an email message. Now, with an email, you've got all kinds of possibilities. In terms of type, you've got different typefaces, but in one typeface, you've got different versions of that typeface, so that you can actually articulate the message in the verbal message by the tone which you give to the actual image of the word itself. I think he put it slightly more obscurely than that, but it was that he did tend to intellectualize things which I can imagine a student might feel awkward in come to terms with. Is this what you're suggesting or not?
Yeah, that was the kind of, since you were contemporaries, like kind of growing at the same time, I was kind of wondering if you have these kind of exchanges about like thinking media through the prism of cultural studies, and if you had like this kind of exchanges with this current.
So basically, what's your connection to the people associated with the New Left and all that?
Well, Stuart Hall was actually quite a friend of Robin's. I didn't know him personally. I mean, I'd sat near him and felt his. And also, I mean, he was extremely important when I think he was in Birmingham. His social studies analyses were. They were all you could call them almost revolutionary, and he doubtless Robin had them. I think they was called something like Journal of Social Studies or something, which was a kind of handbook for some intellectuals. But I'm sorry to say that I simply cannot remember much about his particular line. But he was extremely important, partly, of course, because he was West Indian origin, which made him both an outsider within insider groups, so that he could present a different perspective. But I'm sorry I can't help you with this, partly because
it was like the answer, actually, because I was wondering if you interacted between each other, and apparently it's not the case.
Yes. Yes. Well, Robin Fior was he was friendly with various well-known intellectuals, so that he could carry on conversations with philosophers, even though quite slowly. But yes, I couldn't say whether he had a really good mind, but he was certainly somebody who considered things which I think students would find not interesting, because while on the one hand he could do practical things in a type room with type, at the same time he would be intellectualizing it, when actually there was a certain side in which he used that as an escape from actually practically working, because I can tell you now that I nearly went into partnership with him. I nearly went, And it's something, because he was actually terribly slow. He would ponder for so long that then it could go past the deadline and past the extension of the deadline. And it was, I personally couldn't work like that. Also, of course, he was extremely extravagant, with, not only with buying magazines, but with all kinds of things. As my wife said, all I can remember is his, and that was in the end of the 1950s, his red cashmere sweater. Nobody had cashmere then. That's
well,
sorry, it's not a question. It's just I was lucky because I met Robin Fior, and I spoke a lot with Robin Fior, and I just want to say, if in Portugal now we have a sort of a group of geeks of typography, it is because of Robin Fior. Robin Fior teaches us a lot about typography and how to use it and how to like and express with typography and typefaces and the language. And well, I was one of the lucky ones who have received the teachment of Robin Fior. So it's just an homage of Robin Fior. I want to say it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
it's very nice.
Well, actually, Robin does consider the history of graphic design in Portugal in his PhD, which is quite a late one, which is a very interesting reading on Portuguese graphic design history, because he also does it connecting to something that you were just saying, which is his habit of collecting books. So basically, this history of his is sort of sorted out among books he collects in Portugal, and it's I don't know. This is more like a highlight, I would say. If you can get hold of this document, please read it, especially for the geeks. I think it's interesting enough.
I'm happy to say that I gave 2 of Robin Fior's posters to the Museum of Design in Zurich because I thought they would just disappear. And one of them is this MPLA, and another is maybe it was even the Frelimo poster, so that at least he will be remembered in history in the middle of Europe. Well, thank you for being so patient. I think I should say, but thank you for coming, and I'm so pleased with the exhibition, which I think is so interesting, and I just wish it were in London. Perhaps it will be.
Well, a note. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is that all right, do you think?
I think so.
I